I'll be speaking first and third on the negation.
I'm Rajiv Sharma. I'll be speaking second on the negation. I use he, him pronouns.
All right, so are all the judges ready to get started? Before we begin, could I just get confirmation from the two other judges that you're here and ready to go?
Hi, here, ready to go.
Fantastic, thank you. Is there one more judge?
Alex, can we get confirmation that you're here and ready?
Okay, fantastic. Again, I'm Katie Dorn, first speaker for the affirmation representing Menlo Atherton. My time begins now. Today, Cheryl and I strongly affirm the resolution resolved. The United States federal taxing and spending policy should be managed by an agency modeled after the Federal Reserve. Firstly, for just a little bit of background information, U.S. federal taxing and spending policy is currently determined by the Congress and approved by the president and enforced oftentimes by different various government agencies within the government, such as the IRS, if it's taxing policy, for example, and that's how it works in the status quo. Our plan, however, which is the resolution, the United States federal taxing and spending policy should be managed by an agency modeled after the Federal Reserve, would change that to a policy that is based on the Federal Reserve. So on the solvency, let's talk a little bit about how the Federal Reserve works. The first point here is that the Federal Reserve is governed by a quote, board of governors, which is based in Washington, D.C., who serve fixed 14-year terms. That is to say, almost basically a 14-year maximum. However, those terms are staggered and one term expires every 2 years. The average total time of service for a board of governors member is 5 years, so the average person does not go on to serve for 14 years. Moreover, there's also presence of the 12 regional federal banks that are up for reappointment every five years. So that's how the Federal Reserve works. But the Federal Reserve is also subject to oversight by Congress, which aims to ensure that it achieves the economic objectives of maximum employment and stable prices. The federal chair also has to submit semi-annual reports on monetary policy to Congress. So how would these kinds of policies look if they were implemented or attached to US federal and spending policy as well, and not just the United States Federal Reserve? Given that we would create some sort of similar system in which there's a board of governors as well as regional leaders that create things like spending policies and federal taxing policies, as well as those regional members being more responsible to keeping up with the needs of their specific region and advising and giving that advice to the Board of Governors. Similarly, this Board of Governors will be subject to oversight by Congress, though Congress itself is not the one making the decisions as for like where the money goes. If there is corruption within this new agency, or if there are major issues or major discrepancies, that is something that they would have to report to Congress in these kinds of annual reports or semi-annual reports. Did you say something?
Yeah, question.
Yeah.
In the new structure you're creating, do you retain this board of directors, or do you retain the board of directors and add something else to that?
We would retain a similar structure as to what the Federal Reserve is. It's not really retaining something because it's creating something new. We're not using the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, but we're creating a new similar body like the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, but their specific job is federal taxing and spending policy. That brings us to our first advantage, which is that of corruption and special interests. Let's talk about the uniqueness. The first point here is so-called pork barrel spending. Pork barrel spending is a metaphor for the appropriation of government spending for localized projects that are secured solely or primarily to bring money to a representative's district and not to the district and not to the country as a whole. The A point here is that earmarks, which is money that goes directly to a specific constituency or a specific area, region, or district, amounts to 1/3 of total federal spending every single year. So that indicates that current times, Congress people are using like money for their particular district as a way to gain leverage or a way to gain power on the negotiating ground in Congress, which means that rather than the whole country benefiting from these funds, it's oftentimes people who have lobbyists or people who have a lot of influence in Congress deciding, I want this money to go specifically to my district rather than benefiting the nation as a whole. But secondly, under the uniqueness is government inaction. The interests and goals of lawmakers are often used as leverage to prevent other laws that are practically unrelated from passing. And that's because spending laws often include a number of unrelated policies in them. We'll have something like a federal appropriations bill, but really the federal appropriations bill also talks about healthcare, also talks about social security, also talks about education, and also talks about infrastructure, and also talks about pretty much every issue that the government is responsible for resolving. The A point here is that nearly all of the individual appropriations bills, again, are bundled together, which raises the stakes of disagreement and leads to government inaction because they're unable to get these policies through when they have so many different and controversial policy policies embedded within them. When the spending is packaged into a single large item rather than its individual components, inaction means shutting down the government rather than leaving some parts unfunded temporarily. It's been nearly a quarter century since Congress and the president have enacted each of the required spending bills on time because of these kinds of government shutdowns. Committee consideration of a budget request don't always happen, as party leaders largely drive the negotiation process in a highly partisan manner. The B point is that Congress and the president are also willing to tiptoe near or over the brink of the shutdown for different issues. An example from Clinton's administration was when he threatened to veto any education spending bill that didn't fund a hyper-specific program to create like a national testing program for elementary and middle schoolers, which could possibly result in government shutdowns. Similarly, since then, there have been like handfuls of other government shutdowns and only increasing partisanship within the government. So let's look at the links or how our policy changes the status quo. The first point is that we decrease corruption and special interest in how funding is determined, because Congress people are no longer able to earmark money because they're not the ones responsible for deciding where that money goes, nor can they give in to special interest groups who ask for money for particular industries or particular regions because they quite simply don't have that power within the government. This indicates better policies for all constituents, especially because candidates can't rely on earmarking money to their constituency for re-election, which means they have to focus on actually creating good popular policy rather than just funneling money towards their constituency or funneling money towards their district. But secondly, we force actual compromise in Congress in order to get laws passed, because governments can't rely on things like funding shutdowns because funding is no longer within that area of jurisdiction. So rather than using budgets and tax policies as leverage, we encourage more productive policymaking and negotiation. The impacts is better policymaking. That's important for all aspects of life, from the economy to education to infrastructure. Basically anything that the government has power over is going to be impacted by better policymaking. The second contention is that of stability. The uniqueness, the first point here is that high oil prices, rising interest rates, and waning government aid are all projected to drag down growth in the economy this year, and investor confidence overall is trending downwards. But secondly, tech stocks and particularly software companies are also being hit hard. We've already seen what happens when companies fail to meet growth expectations. Meta, Netflix, and PayPal are providing early warning signs that traders' confidence is already beginning to drain away. But the third point is that tax policies switch quickly between different policies based on who is president or who is in Congress right now in the status quo. For example, under Trump and Republican presidents, laws like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act decreased taxes, but now House Democrats in power have proposed a 26.5% top corporate tax rate and almost a 40% top individual rate, and have also passed other policies that would change or raise tax brackets like the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. But the links, the first point is that we make tax policy more stable because it's not subjected to constant changes in power in the Congress and government, which means there's fewer periods of inaction or government shutdowns, as well as fewer shifts between tax policies based on what's partisan at the time. The second point is perceptual. Partisan investors on either side want their party to accomplish the agenda they voted for. Politicians generally sell their proposed policies to voters by touting the potential winners. If investors broadly fear disruptive legislation, then they will pull out of markets, which can't happen in the status quo. Partisan conflict is also associated with lower investment rates at the firm level, particularly in firms that rely heavily on government spending and those who actively engage in campaign contributions through PACs. So the internal links, essentially we increase investor confidence because we create stable spending and government policies and tax policies, which tells them that it's actually safe to invest because they don't have to fear losing their investments every time the who's in power in Congress shifts, which indicates longer term stable investor confidence, which is important, which is the internal link to the economy as a whole, because businesses and thus consumers can only survive if they have confidence from their investors, which means the impact is the economy, both in the United States and globally, due to United States global investments.
Cool. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm Davis. I use he, him pronouns. I'll speak first and third. The order will be the negation case in order, and then the affirmative case.
How many sheets do I need for the negation case? Like, how many off-case positions do you have?
2.
Okay.
Were you unmuted?
No, but you should turn your volume up so you can hear what they say.
Okay. Cool. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Rajiv and I strongly negate the resolution that the Federal Reserve, or that the long-term Federal Reserve intends to manage U.S. policy independent of political influence. The U.S. federal tax and spending policy should be managed by an agency model after the Federal Reserve. We negate. As negative side, we have the burden to prove the affirmative false, so therefore we're just going to defend the status quo and tell you the status quo is preferable to the world of the affirmative, and tell you the affirmative specifically has more harms than the benefits of sticking with the status quo. We have 2 disadvantages to prove this to be true, and the first is societal welfare. The affirmation gives you a number of points that we think sort of flip to the negative side in the sense that earmarks are inherently good. Congress is good for local knowledge. The first point here specifically that Congress allows for the election of many representatives from various different places across the United States that provide specific local knowledge that have different niches and sort of policy platforms that represent the individuals. For example, here in San Mateo County, we have a lot of specifically Democratic politicians who largely focus on infrastructure issues from Caltrain to a green transition to sustainable energy, whereas we often see this differ in perhaps West Virginian coal towns where they often focus on local constituents on coal. We can also see that earmarks have been inherently good and used by both GOP and Democratic politicians in the past, even though it was largely believed to be GOP focused and often helping Republicans in the past. Not only have they become more transparent in the last 15 years, but it's also been backed by key prominent Democratic politicians, including Harry Reid in 2017, and even endorsed Obama to endorse earmarks. The second point here is that Congress is key for earmarks because it allows for specific spending to go to certain areas that are actually really important, from infrastructure to beyond. Jackie Steer was earmarking specific funds that was able to promote Caltrain electrification in the last 3 years, which ultimately brought the timeline to a good position when it allowed it to actually go through and during the period of COVID. Not to mention, we can also see other earmarked funds for projects like coal projects, for example, or Harry Reid helping Searchlight get benefits, not to mention the rest of Nevada. Third, we can also see that earmark transparency is becoming better than the status quo. Congress has maintained financial integrity by passing impoundment control acts amongst other transparency bills, which allows earmark funds to not only be posted 24 hours before they're included in the bill to allow for adequate review times, but not to mention, like as a result of that, it's becoming more transparent, allowing the greater deliberation on earmarks, and the overall frequency of earmarks hasn't actually decreased, and they're being used typically for both Democratic and Republican sides, which is probably good for local constituents on that level. So what happens when the affirmative plan passes? It reduces the ability for earmarks to be effective. Why? Because the Federal Reserve relies on a board of directors, as the affirmative stated, which is specifically bad for local knowledge, because most of these Federal Reserve board directors rely on economic knowledge and are on the board based on their economics background, as they usually typically control monetary policy and don't contain specific local knowledge because they weren't elected to actually represent their constituents. Indeed, the board of directors at the Fed is elected by Congress and then approved by the president, not by the people, because the people are voting based on their specific interests, whereas Federal Reserve board of directors are based on their economic policy. This creates a situation where we lack economic knowledge or lack local knowledge on things like taxation and spending, which ultimately means we don't get earmarked funds for projects that help local constituents, and more often end up with generic tax policy that doesn't impact individuals and just creates some sort of situation where we're trying to make an effort at stability when indeed it reduces funds for things that actually improve quality of life in local regions, which congressional representatives are so famous for, which is why they're elected. It also reduces sort of congressional power because a lot of what we actually get through Congress come through spending bills, and where, for example, like masks are outside of spending, whereas things like infrastructure are often included in spending bills. So losing jurisdiction over spending is affecting most of the issues that Congress actually deals with, which is particularly problematic for long-term society health and decreases quality of life for the everyday Americans in the sense they don't actually have access to as many basic needs as they had prior. And also sort of renders congressional elections useless, because if we only have people in Congress to debate over what type of curriculum should be implemented in schools as opposed to how we should actually be spending in taxes, this is probably problematic. Also, it largely affects the Republican voters significantly, considering that one of the biggest voting issues for a Republican is on taxation. So if they don't necessarily have control over taxation policy, that's bad. And there's numerous other impacts we could probably conceive of here. For example, if they care about taxation policy only, and the congressperson has no ability to control taxation anymore, what's their incentive to vote? Which is bad for democratic processes. On the second disadvantage, we can call this constitutionality and politicization. First point here is that Article 1, Section 8 specifically gives Congress power to tax individuals, which has been granted since 1776, which has allowed Congress to maintain control of the checkbook or of the American checkbook since America was created. Second, the Fed has, like I mentioned earlier, the Fed has a board of directors, which is specifically very drastically different from the current structure of Congress, and it very much resembles the Supreme Court in the sense that they're elected by Congress and by the president, which is how Supreme Court justices are elected, and they often have long-term periods. That information tells you the sort of the average term is 5 years. However, we look at the current standing. There are 2 Republicans and a Democrat who are filling 3 of the positions, and their terms end in 2026, 2030, and 2034 respectively, and they're likely to serve them out. That means that if with the 14-year term, it's and many of them outside of the higher level positions ultimately serve lifetime terms, which gives them significant standing within the Federal Reserve to actively influence monetary policy for a long period of time. Third, we can also see the power of the purse belongs to Congress. It's granted also by the Constitution, which ultimately means that Congress is sort of overseeing federal spending. And fourth, and we can see the general welfare clause in the Constitution gives Congress the power to spend for their purposes, which they see beneficial. So what happens when the affirmation plan passes? It reduces the strength of the Constitution. And even if they come up and tell you that they have durable fiat and allow you to reverse the Constitution, it still requires constitutional amendments to be changed, which is a significant legislative process, which ultimately means that going back on constitutional amendments that ultimately many people viewed as beneficial, and considering it's been longstanding and has had no changes since 1776, implies that it's one of the most important things that we've seen protected, which goes against past American precedent, which ultimately reduces the strength of our democracy because it means we're going against things we actively viewed as strong. Second link here is that it creates intense politicization. It turns the Federal Reserve into a Supreme Court system where we are electing federal board representatives because we want to have certain policies passed. Right now, they're elected based from Congress based on their economic policies and how they view monetary policies on inflation. If they're in charge of taxation and spending, they're elected based on how they're going to spend for infrastructure or perhaps in charge of other things, which ultimately creates an intense political battle for presidents to elect Federal Reserve members, which ultimately isn't politicized in the status quo, considering economic policy is much less politicized. That is really bad because it creates a scenario in which case you often see divisive language around who is elected, and also creates a scenario in which case you ultimately reduced efficacy because people are often debating on the Supreme Court like Federal Reserve Board, where you're debating what type of policy is passed, which creates ineffective legislation because you have significant polarization based on who's on the court or on the board. On the impacts, that's really bad for American democracy and decreases the integrity of American democracy because we're going against past precedent, which is specifically bad for future constitutional amendments should they be proposed. Not to mention it creates politicization within taxation and spending policy even further than Congress because there's less individuals. There's only 7 individuals, so that one seat holds greater importance than a seat in Congress, and you also have a stronger ability to negotiate within Congress. Let's go to the affirmative case. The first advantage of reduced corrupt and special interest, they tell you that earmarks are specifically bad. They tell you earmarks are corrupt. We tell you earmarks are getting less corrupt than the status quo. They don't really impact this and tell you an example of them being corrupt. We tell you more often than not they're being used for good purpose in the status quo. Not to mention Transparency Act's been passed, and 2007 they allowed for them to be posted 24 hours prior to give greater visibility to them within bills, which means that it's easier for them to be located. Second, they tell you that it accounts for like third of spending. We tell you it accounts for 1% discretionary spending, which ultimately is small in scope. So even if they end up winning this point that it's bad, which they're not going to win, it doesn't account for a large majority of congressional spending. The second point they tell you is that it leads to government inactivity. We tell you turn on the uniqueness level, or like they tell you Congress inactivity is high and they reverse in the link level. On the link level, we tell you they actually turn this. They create greater inactivity because it creates a highly politicized board where they have to oversee a monetary and fiscal policy, where fiscal policy has been separate for the last 300 years, or 250 years, which ultimately is bad because it creates a system where you are constantly fighting over policy based on 7 seats within the board with very long terms. So ultimately that board seat holds a very long time. So you can create a hyper politicized seat. Considering that many seats are open, I think 3 seats are open right now, it creates a system where the next president could elect 3 different individuals who all promote their same ideologies, can create a hyper politicized scenario. That leads to worse compromise because of fighting. Second point about stability, we tell you this is ultimately termed because ineffective legislation is passed, not to mention it creates greater infighting within the region. Also, the Fed oversees interest rates. So the fact that they also oversee interest rates gives them likely greater fluctuations, which means that the uniqueness points they create are actually caused by the organization themselves.
All right. Hello again. My name is Cheryl Chen. I'll be the second speaker for the affirmative. So the order is going to be the neg case and then case. In order to prevent an investor confidence collapse and a subsequent collapse of the world economy, it's imperative that we opt for a bipartisan way to address U.S. tax policy and spending policy, rather than the current system in which we have incessant government shutdowns and partisanship, which is tearing apart our tax policy rather than tearing apart our spending policy rather than spending for the general welfare of society. So let's on their first advantage on societal welfare, the narrative here is that earmarking is actually good, and they talk about how local knowledge is key in order for individual counties needs to be met. I have a few responses. First of all, they talk about how, for example, they talk about green tech in democratic counties, especially in California. However, something that you should consider is that this is not majoritarian, because ultimately the United States only has so much discretionary spending. So this money, it's the same amount of money is being poured into the United States economy. But when we have these certain, for example, they talk about Californian politicians who have a greater say in Congress, that again, that's not majority rule because it's whoever has the most influence, like the most charisma in Congress is able to direct it towards their infrastructure projects, right? Like not every single legislator has an earmark for their county. So again, it's not majoritarian. Ultimately, you sometimes have to sacrifice like an individual county's needs for the general welfare of everyone. But also earmarks they talk about how earmarks, like how it, like, for example, help fund the Caltrain, but more often than not, earmarks are for these big infrastructure projects that like big like buildings or bridges that Congress people can definitively say for theirs. So oftentimes it's more for like decoration rather than actual like utility. And I have a few examples. First is, for example, when Representative Don Young in Alaska directed $223 million of taxpayer funds for a bridge between an Alaskan town and an even smaller island, which is like you do. It was basically, there's a consensus that was like egregiously unnecessary amount of spending, but also you can look to how, for example, Sarah Palin had her like $400 billion earmark project, which eventually had to be stopped because everyone knew it was like obviously a very corrupt deal. But also secondly is that it paves the way for corruption. So like on their link level, this is like where my arguments are, but the second is a turn that actually creates even more corruption. You can look part of earmarking is the fact that like you have to make deals and broker deals within people in Congress, and that's a sure way for special interest groups to insert their interests into Congress. You can look to the fact like there was a report on Jacob Abraham who was like bribing lawmakers in order to earmark and benefit those companies especially. And also this is something that it completely like despite these transparency bills, which like even politicians who have passed these transparency bills have admitted there's so many loopholes, right? Because like special interest groups are always going to be able to have a say in Congress, and that's something that has been legal for a very, very long time. And that's not something, again, like those deals, like there's no way to bring light to that. And that's always going to happen. Obviously, that's not like good for net benefits. But also the third is that of how like earmarks have generally just increased spending dramatically, but unnecessarily. Also, they talk about how people's basic needs are not being met. However, first of all, it's worse for less represented people who have less say in Congress. But also secondly is that the Federal Reserve shows that the board still makes assessments. Like it's not like they're just going to look at America as a whole and say, oh, this is how much we're going to spend on transportation. Obviously, they're going to like make assessments of like the locales and probably going to hear opinions from the news and opinions from other politicians, but still it's not going to be Congress itself, which has a direct interest in getting reelected. All right, on their second contention, yeah, one second. Also, you can consider the fact that earmarks, for example, like back on earmarks, Representative Dennis Hastert was involved in a national scandal when it was revealed that he inserted an earmark of $207 million to create a highway near his own personal property. Like one company boasted at least 172 government earmarks for their professional clients. Also, literally, like when, for example, George W. Bush and other politicians who have passed like earmark transparency acts, they've all come out and admitted that there's been loopholes. So it's something that really can't be resolved. Also, they talk about how, on their second contention about how this is going to erode democracy and it's unconstitutional. I have a few responses. They first talk about the 14-year term limits. First of all, is that people are elected from Congress and the president. So it's not like nearly as partisan as they talk about, like versus Congress, which is elected directly from like the people. Oh yeah. So like they're elected from Congress, so they obviously have to have some sort of qualifications. But also secondly, this is non-unique. Incumbency proves in Congress that like they're literally people who have been in Congress like more than like I've been alive, right? So that proves that like obviously this is not something unique to our plan, but if anything, they're at least more qualified because they're elected by Congress and the president. But also they talk about how it leads to politicization. Again, this is non-unique because it can be more politicized in Congress itself. And especially when you look to the fact of like the government shutdowns, we literally had a government shutdown this year. It's not just that politicization is bad, polarization is bad, but it's also that like nothing is done. Like it's better to have at least some spending in like healthcare and things like that rather than people literally not receiving their paychecks, especially like not able to like like get their next like insulin treatment or things like that, like things people really rely on and use people's lives are at stake. Again, they talk about how economics is much less politicized. Like I really don't know where they got this narrative. You can look to the fact that Trump's 2020 campaign was entirely hinged off of like economic growth and cutting taxes for businesses. Also, the constitutional amendment is not an issue because we've done it 27 times before and it's fine. And if anything, like there's probably a loophole to it as well because Congress technically still has indirect control over spending because they elect people onto the board. So like really that's not an issue. But either way, the most important impact is that of investor confidence. And they talk about how investor confidence is going to be worse because of infighting. Again, like infighting, they entirely ignore our uniqueness, but how infighting is much more of a problem with with Congress. You can look to like the fact that the Federal Reserve hasn't like stalled their next decision on interest rates because of like a lack of bipartisanship, right? And this like board is inherently bipartisan and cannot act as Congress, meaning like it has to like meet the deadlines for the next budget. So this turn is like really has no effect, meaning that you can extend our links about. No, sorry, I don't have time. But you can extend our links about how stability is key to investor confidence. Otherwise, every election cycle, investors are going to be pulling out because, for example, they might maybe it's just perceptual. They don't align with democratic ideology, or they feel like they're like environmental legislation or other things like that is going to like erode their business, which is why like business are already pulling out. And we're already in such an unstable place that this would entirely collapse the world economy. And the warrant for that is that the world economy's 80% of liquidity is in the United States dollar and 65% of all currency reserves in the US. This collapses the world economy, and also states that politicization would make the Federal Reserve responsible for too much. But in reality, we're creating a second agency, not making the Federal Reserve responsible for more. So this isn't relevant. Also, this is this could be detrimental, especially in terms like research wars. As a necessity for research cause miscalculation, mistakes, makes war inevitable. And also like you can look to have fact how the Carter doctrine justified goal for. So this is like a war scenario versus like their stuff about how earmarking is good, which like really has negligible impact comparison to this. In order to have stability, we need a bipartisan board which can meet its deadlines, but also you can extend like our stuff about corruption. Like they basically just extended their disadvantage as a turn, but I already responded to that. We tell you about how government, not just pork barrel spending, right? Like that's obviously a phenomenon that happens, but also government inaction, which is a major thing. For example, like when Bill Clinton threatened to veto an education spending bill that did not fund his proposal to create a voluntary national testing program for 4th and 8th graders. So like, sure, like that's great, but like there's also like billions of dollars that need to be spent in other areas. Also, they say that that the resolution will vote if Congress can't control taxes, but that's not true because they still have indirect power and control over a lot of important
time is up.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll be starting off with an overview, then I'll be moving into the constitutionality sheet, then I'll be moving into the societal welfare sheet, then the affirmation case in the order that it was read, that is to say corruption and stability. You can flow the overview, let's say on a new sheet. Is anyone not ready? No? If anyone has questions, please just use the raise hand feature. I have the Zoom open on my screen. I'd like to do that to minimize feedback through the speakers. The affirmation makes a couple of key concessions that will end up losing them the round. First, they concede that a Federal Reserve that is going to be handling fiscal, monetary, and economic policy is going to be exactly like the Supreme Court of the United States. What that means is that this institution is inherently going to be politicized, and there is going to be long-terms instituted. The second point here is that it's not just the board of directors that matters. My partner tells you that there are other sub-level positions that are specifically having functional lifetime terms. This means that if a president and Congress elects someone, they are functionally going to be serving for an extended period of time. We can give you the example of Alan Greenspan, who literally who was last serving as Fed chair in 2006, who served for nearly 20 years. This probably indicates that there's going to be less flip-flopping and thus no way to get rid of corrupt individuals, unlike Congress, where people have 2-year terms and can be voted out every election cycle. This is going to be critical towards getting rid of the corruption advantages that the affirmation articulates in their first and second speech. Let's go into the disadvantage about constitutionality. The main central response that the affirmation makes here is that the board of directors is going to be appointed by Congress. We give you 2 responses. First, this indicates that it is exactly like SCOTUS. This means that you can appoint unqualified people like Amy Coney Barrett, who literally could not recite the First Amendment in its entirety, and appoint them to functionally lifetime terms. The second point here is that the affirmation double turns themselves. Either Congress isn't corrupt and therefore the people that they appoint aren't corrupt, or Congress is corrupt as they tell us, and therefore the federally elected people are going to be corrupt. Either way, it fundamentally means that the success of the Federal Reserve institution that they're creating is dependent on Congress. That means that the negation or the status quo is the linchpin here. This double turn is going to be central in today's round, and it's the only way that the affirmation can get access to their impacts. They specifically are telling you that Congress is corrupt. That means that the people that Congress is going to be appointing are likely going to be corrupt as well. This demolishes their case. The only way that they can get access to their impacts is if Congress is not corrupt, meaning that we get access to those to that strength of link before. Let's go into the, you can extend all of the other uniqueness points where we tell you that Congress maintains unilateral power over power of the purse. And this allows them to oversee spending. And the fourth uniqueness point that this allows for general welfare spending, which is going to be key to the livelihoods of active constituents. Go into the link level. The first issue on the, they only have one response here, which is that constitutional amendments have been done 27 times before. We give you two responses here. First, we tell you that constitutional amendments have not been passed in the past couple of decades. This is because they're specifically controversial in our politically polarized world that we know today. That means that you can't use these antiquated warrants that were literally coming from hundreds of years ago. This means that another constitutional amendment is likely going to have major political backlashes. The second point is we specifically tell you that the power of the purse and spending is a major issue, and making a constitutional amendment is going to be particularly damning for it. This is because it's been the same for 250 years. This likely indicates that severing it and putting it into the hands of a corrupt and fundamentally stagnant institution is going to be incredibly harmful. Secondly, on the issue of politicization, they don't really respond to this link here. We're going to make two additional points. First, you can extend the double turn from above. Either Congress is politically corrupt, and that means that the representatives they elect to the Federal Reserve Board are going to be corrupt as well, or Congress isn't corrupt. That means that we win on this point. Secondly, we also tell you that this is just going to lead to large numbers of disagreements. You can extend the point that Davis makes, where the three currently appointed people, the three currently appointed members of the Board of Governors are going to have their terms end in 2026, 2030, and 2034. This is going to be major. On the issue of the impacts, we're going to be telling you that the investor confidence point is going to be key. But in order to understand the significance, we need to move to the most significant disadvantage articulated by the negation, which is that of societal welfare. The societal welfare point is going to be key. First, we are evidently show you here that the earmarks that are articulated by the negation in their first speech are critical to local knowledge and local projects. The only substantive ink that the affirmation has on this point is that the Fed Board of Directors on the link level are going to read the news. And that means that they will be able to understand local projects for the hundreds of different representatives in the House and the Senate. Judges, this is laughable. Fundamentally, the Fed Board of Reserve is not going to be able to institute these earmarks. What we are going to see is unilateral blanket policies that are going to end up harming that are going to end up harming the average person out there. On the responses on the uniqueness level, they specifically give us two responses of Don Young and Sarah Palin. We're going to give the big response here that both of these claims were specifically made prior to the 2007 rule change. In fact, it was Don Young's $227 million bridge to nowhere that specifically was the trigger that instituted the 2007 rule change. This probably indicates that these specific warrants should not be evaluated in today's round. The second response here is they specifically tell us that it's not majoritarian spending and that it's and that this isn't ruled by the average person, but judges, anyone can write an earmark into power. Just because a congressional district does not have an earmark is not because that representative does not have power. It's because they made an active choice to do so. If anything, earmarking is more majoritarian. This means that you can extend the second uniqueness point where we tell you that Congress is key for local knowledge. And that thirdly, you can extend the third uniqueness point that this is key for transparency in comparison to the Fed, which is not transparent at all. This is probably going to be an independent voting issue on investor confidence because investors want transparency about economic policy. You can extend extend the specific points that they make. That means that we're turning their case entirely. Extend the link level. We can specifically show you that it's transparent. They're not going to be reading the news. That means on the impact level, tax policy is going to, less transparent tax policy is going to be harming individual consumers because they won't be able to get local specific policies that are going to help them, such as new infrastructure bills that will provide jobs and therefore decrease poverty, or tax deductions such as salt tax deductions, which are going to be great for people in high tax local states. This means that you are going to be harming the economy more. On the corruption point, we actively control the double turn here in order for Congress to not be corrupt, or rather, in order for the Federal Reserve to not be corrupt, Congress has to not be corrupt. If Congress isn't corrupt, then that probably means that it's going to be better because there's less infighting and transparent policies can be passed. On the other hand, even if the Federal Reserve isn't corrupt, there is going to be no localization of policies and there is going to be long-term infighting. There is no term limits. This is just going to lead to SCOTUS, which in the few times where it isn't corrupt is simply partisan. It is not bipartisan whatsoever. If you want the bipartisan solution, you vote for the negation where active parties and average people can have their voices heard. Secondly, we can specifically tell you that earmarks are not a major issue. One of their major uniqueness points is that of pork barrel spending. You can extend the point where it's only 1% of discretionary spending. This goes unresponded by the MG. We also tell you in our third response that this is going to lead to greater inaction, and this is going to harm investor confidence. On the stability point, they specifically tell you that interest rates hikes are causing a massive amount of investor confidence instability. This is specifically linked to the Fed. We specifically are going to be telling you that the Fed is what's leading to investor underconfidence. And it's the kind of spending that Congress passes and the stability that Congress brings that allows for actual investor confidence to go up. Additionally, the Fed engineered the 2008 housing crisis. This probably means that they're worse than the global economy, and any likewise institutions are also going to be harming the global economy. You vote neg. Thank you.
How was that? Good. Great. For an order, it will be just layers and preempts. So voting issues and then preempts. Cool. Is anyone not ready? No? The first place to vote for the negative, of the many places you can vote for the negative, is on the societal welfare point. The affirmation doesn't do nearly enough work. Specifically, they only focus on defensive responses to tell you why Congress is inherently corrupt. Again, this links into a double turn, which is the second voting issue, but the fact of the matter is Congress simply isn't corrupt. We tell you that the 2007 rule change that instituted a 24-hour posted period of earmarks ultimately led to better transparency within earmarks and has allowed for specific local knowledge policies to be passed, which is allowing local residents to feel actually some sort of representation in Congress. And regardless, even if some congressional members don't necessarily use earmarks all the time, they still have the fundamental ability to do so, which is inherently key for accessing societal welfare. The affirmation hasn't told you why the Federal Reserve is going to be good for earmarks, and they can't come up in the last speech and tell you. We tell you simply that reading the news isn't providing the level of local knowledge that someone living in the actual area provides, not to mention the congressperson already had a platform to run on based on the local issues that they gathered from hearing from residents, whereas reading the news simply is a laughable take on why they would actually get knowledge. The affirmation advocating for people reading the news to gain knowledge on constituents likely leads to worse policy in the long term if they try to get local knowledge from reading the news, which ultimately is probably skewed by media biases. Like my partner said, reading news is a terrible way to do that, which probably leads to worse societal welfare outcomes, and there's a place to vote for the next. That impact is a high magnitude and probability. It's very probable that someone who, if Congress people or earmarks are not necessarily as plausible anymore, specifically with regard to the budget, means that welfare is specifically decreased at a high probability, and that's high magnitude considering that electrification projects, coal projects are good for the local economy jobs, which is also key to investor confidence, which means that we're controlling the interlinked investor confidence. If economies aren't necessarily booming because we don't have policies that support them, the affirmation can't win the investor confidence point. The second place to vote is on the double turn. The affirmation tries to tell you that Congress is inherently corrupt, which means that if they're winning the point that Congress is corrupt, they can't win the round, because that means that Congress is inherently electing corrupt representatives to the federal board of directors in this new Fed model that they're creating, which is really bad for fiscal policy. However, we tell you that they're not winning that point, which probably means you buy our analysis that Congress isn't corrupt. In the scenario where Congress isn't corrupt, that implies that Congress is doing a good job in the status quo, where they're actually focusing on bipartisan bills and ultimately passing good earmarks. Even if Congress isn't corrupt, that still leads to a Federal Reserve. Perhaps if they're not, perhaps they may be elected in a fair way, but that leads to hyper-politicization, because the affirmation hasn't won the politicization point either, because we tell you specifically they didn't give any contextualized responses to the SCOTUS argument. It inherently creates a board that models off of SCOTUS, where you have open seats every now and then with long terms, where the president and Congress can elect someone who fits their spending ideologies rather than actual individuals who want someone to represent their own ideologies. It's focusing more on Congress itself as opposed to individuals. They may come up in the last speech and tell you that special interests are inherently buying Congress people, but can't buy the Federal Reserve. Don't let them get away with this. We've already told you that special interests exist both on the Federal Reserve and both in Congress, which implies that that doesn't matter because you can still have special interests influencing this new policy within their structure. That means the constitutionality point is not going to be a voting point, is not going to be a voting issue for the negation, but you can use it as offense against the affirmative. Specifically, it leads to hyperpoliticization, which is particularly bad for the affirmation trying to impact stability, because if you have hyperpoliticization discussing policy issues, it leads to no effective change, whereas Congress is actually getting things passed, even if it takes slightly different amounts of time. Not to mention the flip-flop exists on both sides. You can have policy changes change every few years from the Federal Reserve and in Congress. We also tell you that Congress is relatively stable over time. Okay, with that being said, let's go to a couple of the preempts. The affirmation, they tell you in the MG the biggest issue is investor confidence, so they have to go for this in the last speech. We tell you they're clearly losing investor confidence. Considering the Fed is leading to interest rate hikes in the status quo, which they tell you is leading to high oil prices and tech stocks being hit hard, that probably indicates the Federal Reserve is doing a poor job at managing monetary policy. If they're giving the Federal Reserve a charge of monetary and fiscal policy, it likely leads to similar effects, not to mention the fact that they're incentivizing those Federal Reserve board members to read the news to make estimates on how they're going to do fiscal policy, which probably leads to damaging fiscal policy, which affects investor confidence because they have no idea how they're going to control it. Why have economists manage how we're going to spend money on infrastructure in California when it was doing with the good job from Congress members? They can't win the investor confidence point because we control the internal link. Don't let them get away with corruption because it double turns themselves, because if they prove that it's inherently corrupt, that means they link into a corrupt Federal Reserve system, which creates no effective policy. And also we're winning both directions with that, which means the affirmation is, the negative has both high magnitude and high probability impacts, which leaves the affirmation no ability to win the round.
I was going to call a point of order on the argument that you can't trust the plans board because the Federal Reserve is hiking up interest rates, which is leading to like recession right now. That argument was entirely new on investor confidence.
Sorry, we missed the first half of your POO because our audio was muted. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, the POO was on the argument that interest rates, the fact that the Federal Reserve is hiking up interest rates proves that the board is not going to do its job either. It's going to lead to like a decline in investor confidence is an entirely new response to our second advantage on investor confidence.
The LOC, I read an argument that the Federal Reserve is in charge of interest rates, and the fact that they're high indicates that the Federal Reserve probably isn't managing that well.
Judge's discretion.
Okay. So again, I'm Katie Doran. I'll be the last speaker for the affirmation from Menlo Atherton. In this final speech, it's just going to be an overview and some extensions, which you can throw on our second stability/investor confidence advantage. And then I'll be talking about corruption. So that's going to be disadvantage 2 from their side, as well as our first advantage on corruption. And then lastly, I'll be talking about societal welfare. I would recommend flowing off to the side or on a separate sheet of paper, as I'm not going to be going so much by line, but the biggest issues on each aspect of the debate. The most important impact in today's debate is investor confidence. We've told you that investor confidence is the internal link to the entire economy, because businesses and consumers cannot be successful if businesses don't get funding and can't be successful and thus can't garner consumers. This indicates that whoever wins the economy impact has to be whoever is winning the investor confidence impact. If we win investor confidence, we win the highest magnitude impact in today's debate. Cheryl already tells you that US economic collapse, which is imminent with our lack of investor confidence in the status quo due to the flip-flopping of tax policies, will collapse the world economy because 80% of liquidity is in the US dollar and 65% of current reserves are in the US dollar, which means that a collapse of the US dollar or a collapse of the US economy affects the entire world economy. And what will cause a collapse of the US economy? Lack of investor confidence. That means that if we win our investor confidence argument, we win the entirety of the world economy impacts, which affects the entire world and not just the United States. And thus is the most important impact in today's debate, which means whoever controls investor confidence is the one who wins. Let's break that down a little bit. Okay, my opponents, I isolate 3 specific responses my opponents bring up to the investor confidence argument, all of which are blipped out at the end of the MO with 20 seconds left, but I'll address all of them anyway. The first, they say that the Federal Reserve is what causes the investor confidence to decrease due to interest rate changes, but they don't respond to our specific warning as for how current instability is caused by waning government aid to certain industries, as well as changing in tax policies. It's not just about interest rates. Interest rates respond to the economy and to stocks and to inflation. They are not unpredictable. Investors expect there to be some level of inflation and some level of adjusting of interest rates anyway. That's not what's responsible for the lack lack of investor confidence. You can extend all of our uniqueness about how from between the Trump and Biden administrations, there were huge changes in tax policies. And this is just a continuation of what's been happening for decades. Like the fact is the status quo is quite unstable and they can't resolve that. But the second response I say is that like congressional stability is why investor confidence ever increases. They provide absolutely no warrant as for why that's the case. That's not responsive to the fact that Congress is far from being stable, has numerous government shutdowns, changes tax policies often, and is entirely unreliable. They can't just say that Congress is stable without providing it like a warranting as for why that's true. Okay, next they then say thirdly that the Federal Reserve caused the 2008 crisis, which means they're bad. That's a pretty bold claim to make without a whole lot of warranting as for what exactly happened in 2008. I would argue that the 2008 collapse is about independent banks that weren't necessarily being entirely controlled by the Federal Reserve itself. Also, you shouldn't really just accept a blippy argument that like a huge economic crash that had a lot of factors such as the housing crisis going into it as well, and lowering and like changes in housing policy and housing prices because of the housing crisis, which was independent of banks and the Federal Reserve. Like you can't just make a bold claim that that entire recession was caused by the Federal Reserve. You probably shouldn't be buying that. Thus, we're winning the investor confidence impact, which is the most important impact in today's round, especially because it's the highest magnitude. You should value high magnitude over high probability impacts because high probability impacts are more reversible, or like high probability but low magnitude impacts are more reversible and can be resolved in the future with different policy changes. But a huge magnitude collapse of the world economy is going to cause death and poverty in the short term because people don't have access to the resources that they need to survive. Okay. All right, let's go into the politicization as well as the corruption point. I'm sort of combining both of these. There are four main issues. Okay, there are three main issues that I want to talk about on this level of debate. The first is the non-unique argument. My opponents, like, Congress is always going to be far worse than any issues that we see with incumbency or partisanship in this new agency, right? Like Congress is already hugely partisan. That's why we have these government shutdowns. And Congress also has a lot of incumbency. There are Congress people who have been in office for like multiple decades. So if anything, like it's a non-unique issue up to both sides if incumbency and corruption is really the issue. But moreover, like they try to say that like the success of this new agency is going to be reliant on Congress, and that if Congress is corrupt, it will elect corrupt individuals. But it's a lot less direct control, which means that like that control isn't going to be so direct in the first place. So even if Congress is corrupt, they can't make this new agency super corrupt. Just as the Federal Reserve is a whole lot better than like Congress itself, which we'll get into more later on. But secondly, they bring up this example of SCOTUS and the Supreme Court and the Federal Reserve as being more politicized. But in reality, these bodies are not nearly as bad as Congress. Despite like lifetime appointments in SCOTUS, it is still largely considered to be at least less partisan than Congress. Sure, SCOTUS is not immune to partisanship, and we're not going to argue that this new agency is going to be entirely immune to partisanship either, but it's still going to be a whole lot better. Moreover, even if people have the opportunity for a whole lot of long terms in the Federal Reserve, which is what we're basing this off of, most of them don't choose to do that. They only have 5-year average terms, which means that they're not looking for the best way to get reelected. They're looking for the best policy for the United States because they're not so worried about this level of partisanship. If anything, these policies are going to be a whole lot better. But thirdly, on the constitutional amendment issue, we tell you that it's not a big issue because amendments have already been passed 27 times. They try to tell you this is like an outdated warrant, but they also don't respond to Cheryl's loophole argument, which she tells you that this isn't actually as big of a change as it might seem because Congress still has indirect control, which indicates that we're not necessarily going entirely against the Constitution because we still give Congress some level of control over taxing and some level of control over the purse, which means that we may not even require an amendment, or if we do require an amendment, it's not going to be such a huge overhaul that's going to cause the kind of controversy they talk about. But even if it did, that kind of controversy really isn't the biggest impact when compared to investor confidence. Let's talk about the disadvantage on societal welfare. Also, you can extend it the like incumbency fact that like a lot of congressional individuals are incumbent. Okay, on earmarks, first off, the federal agency will understand local needs. That's why we have local and regional leaders. But even if they didn't, earmarks aren't about what a country needs. It's about who's powerful in Congress. Even after the 2007 law, which Bush himself said failed, there were still earmarks of $207 million for a highway near the house of a congressperson, as well as one company getting 172 earmarks. These specific examples are different from the ones that they isolate, are examples that come from post 2007, which shows that earmarks in Congress now are just an issue of partisanship and special interest. If we want to reform, we must create a new agency.
Thank you so much, y'all.